Ethan Sterling had everything: money, power, and a reputation as one of the city's most successful men. But there was one thing he lacked: respect for his own wife. Grace had once been the love of his life, but over the years, he had grown ashamed of her. She didn't fit the glamorous image he wanted to project, so he hid her from the world, replacing her with a younger, more beautiful mistress. At a luxurious party, Ethan proudly arrived with his mistress, believing he had won. But when Grace walked in, stunning, confident, and accompanied by a billionaire more powerful than him, Ethan realized too late that the woman he had discarded was the one thing he could never replace. The grand ballroom shimmered with golden chandeliers, their glow reflecting off crystal glasses and polished marble floors. It was the kind of party that only the elite attended, a night of wealth, power, and status. Ethan Sterling, the millionaire businessman, moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who knew he owned the room. But tonight, he wasn't here with his wife. Instead, he had brought someone else: Sophia, his stunning young mistress. She clung to his arm, her red dress hugging her perfect figure, her laughter like music to his ears. She was everything his wife, Grace, was not, or so he thought. Grace had been his wife for years, but he had grown ashamed of her. She wasn't glamorous like the women in his circle. She didn't fit the mold of the rich and beautiful socialites who graced these extravagant parties. Instead, she was simple, modest, and, in his eyes, boring. She had gained weight over the years, no longer the young, vibrant woman he had once married. And so, he had pushed her aside, keeping her hidden while he flaunted Sophia in public. Tonight was no different. He had lied to Grace, telling her he had a business event. He never invited her to these things anymore. He didn't want to be seen with her. But what Ethan didn't know was that tonight, everything was about to change. The party was in full swing when whispers began to spread across the ballroom. Heads turned toward the entrance. Gasps filled the air. Ethan, caught in a conversation with a wealthy investor, barely noticed until he heard Sophia's sharp intake of breath. He turned to see what the commotion was about. And then, his heart stopped. There, standing at the entrance, was Grace. But she wasn't the woman he had left behind at home. No, this Grace was different. Stunning, radiant, breathtaking. She wore a sleek, black evening gown that fit her perfectly, her curves accentuated in a way that turned heads. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled elegantly. She carried herself with a confidence Ethan had never seen before, and beside her stood none other than James Holloway, the billionaire investor Ethan had been desperately trying to impress for months. James had his hand placed gently on the small of Grace's back, guiding her into the room as if she were royalty. The entire crowd watched as they walked together, whispering among themselves. Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. He had never seen Grace like this before. She was glowing, and worst of all, she looked happy. His grip tightened on Sophia's wrist as Grace and James approached. "Ethan," Grace greeted him with a polite smile, her voice smooth and controlled. "I didn't expect to see you here." Ethan struggled to find his words. "Grace, what are you doing here?" James chuckled, placing a protective arm around her waist. "She's here as my guest," he answered smoothly. "Grace and I have been working closely together on a new project." Ethan's mind raced. Grace, working with James Holloway? That was impossible. She was just his wife, the woman he had pushed aside, the woman he had assumed would always stay in the background. How could she possibly be connected to one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the city? Sophia, sensing the tension, clung to Ethan's arm. "And who is this?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Grace turned her gaze to Sophia, her eyes cool and unreadable. "Oh, I don't believe we've met," she said sweetly, "but I do know who you are." Sophia's smirk faltered. Ethan cleared his throat. "Grace, we should talk." But Grace only smiled. "There's nothing to talk about, Ethan. Everything is exactly as it should be." With that, She turned her attention back to James, her laughter light and genuine as they walked further into the party. The crowd continued to murmur, some guests openly smirking in Ethan's direction. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt small. As the night progressed, Ethan couldn't focus. His mind was fixated on Grace. He watched as she moved through the room, speaking effortlessly with the city's most powerful figures. People who had never given her a second glance before were now vying for her attention. It was as if she had transformed into someone else entirely. But the more Ethan watched, the more he realized this was always who she had been. He had simply been too blind to see it. James leaned in to whisper something in Grace's ear, making her laugh softly. Ethan's fists clenched. He had never seen her this way with him. When had she become so distant? So untouchable? Desperate, he finally cornered her near the terrace, away from prying eyes. "Grace," he started, his voice softer now. "We need to talk." She took a sip of champagne before looking at him. "About what, Ethan?" His jaw tightened. "What's going on? Since when are you involved with James Holloway?" She tilted her head, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Since I stopped waiting for you to see my worth." He swallowed hard. "Grace, She raised a hand, cutting him off. "No, Ethan. You don't get to do this. You made your choice a long time ago. You paraded your mistress around in front of our friends. You were ashamed of me." Ethan felt his throat go dry. "I wasn't." The words stung like a slap. Grace took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Do you know what the best part is?" she whispered. "I never needed you. You needed me. But it took you losing me to realize that." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had spent years believing Grace would always be there waiting, hoping, loving him despite everything. He had been wrong. Because now, as she turned away from him without a second thought, Ethan realized the truth. Grace had moved on. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Sterling had lost. He had spent years believing Grace would always be there waiting, hoping, loving him despite everything. He had been wrong. As she walked away, her head held high, Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Regret. It clawed at him, bitter and relentless. He had spent years taking her for granted, assuming she would always be the woman who waited for him at home, the one who forgave his cruelty, who overlooked his affairs. He had convinced himself that she had no other choice but to stay. But now, watching her disappear into the crowd, he realized she had made a choice, one that didn't include him. Ethan turned to glance at Sophia, who was still clinging to his arm. But for the first time, she felt like a stranger. Her beauty, which once thrilled him, now felt empty. Compared to Grace, who radiated confidence and strength, Sophia suddenly seemed like nothing more than a fleeting distraction. He wanted to call out to Grace, to stop her, to tell her he was sorry, that he had been blind. But what could he say? That he only saw her worth now that she was no longer his? That he only realized her beauty after she had found someone who truly valued her? No, he had lost her. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Sterling learned what it felt like to be truly alone.